It's estimated there are 61 million owned dogs and 66 million owned cats in the EU, but sadly there's very little in the way of EU legislation to protect them. This means that it's left to the individual member states to introduce legislation on dogs and cats. In 2015, the EU Dog and Cat Alliance produced a groundbreaking paper explaining just why EU legislation on the breeding and trade of dogs is needed. I leave it to our member organisations to explain the state of legislation in their countries.
In Ireland, anyone who keeps 6 or more female dogs aged over 6 months and capable of breeding must register with their local authority as a dog breeding establishment and pay a fee ranging from €400 to €3,000 depending on the number of bitches on site.
In Ireland, dog breeding is regulated by the Dog Breeding Establishments Act 2010. In April this year, the ISPCA raided a licensed and registered dog breeding establishment and removed over 350 dogs and 11 horses that were living in horrific conditions. The legislation isn't working.
We have no cat-specific legislation in Ireland.
In the UK, dog breeding legislation is a matter for our devolved administrations, which means the legislation in England, Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland is all different.
In Scotland, dog breeders who breed 5 litters or more in a 12-month period must have a licence.
Wales introduced new dog breeding legislation in 2015. So breeders who keep 3 or more breeding bitches and produce 3 or more litters in a 12-month period must be licensed. And when applying for a licence, they need to provide details of a socialisation programme for the dogs.
In England, a licence is required by any place that's in the business of breeding and selling dogs. In addition, anyone breeding 5 or more litters of puppies in a 12-month period is required to have a licence, regardless as to whether or not they're intending to sell those puppies later.
In Northern Ireland, breeding establishments must be licensed if they're keeping 3 or more breeding bitches and producing 3 or more litters in a 12-month period. And they must also, in applying for a licence, provide written details of a socialisation programme.
There are no specific requirements for cat breeders in any part of the UK.
And so I think the UK is a good example of how much the legislation can vary even within one EU member state.
In Lithuania, pet breeders must have a permit issued by the State Food and Veterinary Service as soon as cats and/or dogs are bred commercially and authorisation is required.
In Malta, breeders are regulated by the microchip laws and the Animal Welfare Act. Dog breeders are licensed and regulated, but only if they intend to breed more than 4 litters a year. Many get out of this by setting up accidental matings. The law specifies age limits and mating frequency as well as age of sale. Selling before 8 weeks is illegal. Giving away is not regulated, which is again a loophole that many use to move puppies out sooner. There are no regulations whatsoever on cat breeding.
Our country is divided into 20 regions, and each of them implements in different ways the standard national framework on commercial activities with pets. There are regional rules even for the trade of dogs and cats in markets.
In Slovenia, we have compulsory identification and registration of dogs in a central database, not linked to an EU database, and no requirement to identify and register cats. Internet trade is not regulated.
Legislation doesn't include specific requirements for dog and cat breeders. Only in the region of Catalonia we have 360 legal dog and cat breeders.
It's clear that legislation to protect dogs and cats varies enormously throughout the EU. Without EU legislation, there are likely to be serious implications not only for dog and cat welfare, but also for public health, consumer protection, and the EU internal market. The EU Dog and Cat Alliance believes that now is the time for the EU to take action to protect dogs and cats. We're calling for a system of compulsory identification and registration of dogs and cats. We're also calling for EU legislation to ensure that all dog and cat breeders are licensed by member states.